Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Airbnb Nomads podcast. And on this week's Property Education Masterclass, we are joined by the incredible and truly inspiring Julie Talbot. Now, Julie has spent the last few years building a completely passive and 100% hands-off property portfolio in the UK, whilst at the same time, she is traveling the world with her partner and her young family. I find it incredibly inspiring the way that Julie's blending property investment with her best life. And I just hope that after listening to this, it inspires you to do the same. Now, if you get knowledge from this podcast, guys, I would massively appreciate a follow and a review on whichever platform you're listening to. Until then, grab yourself a cuppa, settle in. This is an incredibly inspiring episode. I can't wait for you to hear it. Here we go. Julie Talbot, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you. Great to speak to you.
Yeah, so we've had a little bit of connection. God, how long back are we going now when we first kind of touch base on socials?
I think we were traveling, so I think it's been around about 2 years, maybe just under, something like that.
I was gonna say a couple of years ago. So you caught my eye, and obviously we're going to get into this in quite a deep way because of the way that you live, which I think, I think it's amazing. I mean, I'm very excited and inspired to hear your story because you are proof of someone who has taken the hard work and success that you've created through property, and you are now using those rewards and that hard work, in my opinion, to live your best life, right? You're not using those rewards to go out and buy, cars and all of that stuff that most people tend to do, which I believe brings you this kind of short-term happiness hit. And then after that, it just becomes a pain, right? You are living your best life, which I think is incredible. And I think there are a lot of people now post-COVID, excuse me, and we're going to get into this, who are started to wake up. They've started to wake up a little bit to really what life is all about, right? It's short. We need experiences, communities, memories, travels, things that we can take with us when it's all said and done. So I'm really, really inspired and excited to hear your story because you are living proof that it can be done. So first of all, where are you now, Julie? Where are you coming in from?
We are in Malaysia at the moment on a little island off the main coast of Malaysia called Penang.
Incredible. And obviously we're going to talk about this in detail, but how long have you been away and how long have you been funding this incredible way, this incredible way of life through your property business, which is based in the UK?
Yeah, well, we've been outside the UK for 15 years now. So I was, technically the trailing spouse for 13 years. And not a great phrase, but that's apparently what wives are called. People are called who follow the partner to an expat job. So we were expats for 13 years. And then my husband decided to retire a couple of years ago so we could spend more time with the kids, slow travel the world, and take on more of a nomadic lifestyle. Wow.
Okay. So let's take it right back to the start. So obviously you're from the UK. When can you? I'm just trying to think in my own head. Obviously, we were just chatting. Right, I've been away most of my adult life, traveling the world, going to cool places, doing all the things that I just mentioned, and I'm trying to think how far back and how early on in my life it was where I started having this need for more. And for me personally, it went right back to when I was about 20, 21. I was in my apprenticeship program in a dark, cold garage in Essex in the UK. And even then, without any prompts, without anybody telling me there's more, there was something inside of me that was just like, this sucks. Like this, there has to be more to life than this. So when was it for you, and where does that bug come from, or that drive for a different life?
Oh, well, funny you should say. I suppose not really thought of it in this way, but going back to first job, went to university, got the corporate job, which I was so happy to get. I really loved it, and then just started to feel quite soon, gosh, actually, maybe this isn't really making me happy, and I couldn't really articulate it in those words sort of then. but I remember being in like some sort of team icebreaker sort of session, you know, those sort of ones that you get in corporate, like, you know, no one knows each other. Let's all draw a picture and explain what it means. And I was like, oh my God, I just don't want to be here. And I remember drawing a picture of something like a world and a surfboard. And I was like, I just want to surf around the world. And like, was quite throwaway about it. And yes, that must have been like
what kind of age were you then, Julie? Just out of
probably like mid 20s. Yeah, probably like mid 20s.
okay.
Yeah, 24, 25, something like that. And yeah, this great job, but then clearly that itch, I suppose, that itch to do something. And I travelled to a few places with work. I did an assignment in France for a year, which was amazing. Lived in Paris, but then was back to the UK and was back in London. And I just really wanted some sort of like, I wasn't using the phrase location freedom then, but I just wanted to be like free to go where I wanted. And I wasn't work shy, but I just wanted to be free where I wanted to, you know, just to take work wherever I wanted to go, kind of thing.
And where can you is there any, was there an influence in your life? Because I know with me, my father traveled a lot. You know, he'd done, you know, back when it was proper traveling in the 60s, right? Where you didn't have a credit card, you didn't have a phone. It was hardcore. You just grab your toothbrush and, you know, your American Express, you know, vouchers and away you go. But so I believe that's where my drive came from, for wanting to see the world, for wanting to create this different life. Was there any influence in your world? Was parents or friends, or was it just all in you?
That's a good question. I've not really thought about it before. My grandparents like travel. They like, you know, once or twice a year they'd go on a holiday. So we're talking like back in the 80s, and they'd go to like Russia and China and, you know, places like that. So maybe that was it, but I wasn't really watching travel shows. I wasn't watching anything like that. So yeah, I don't know if it's
right.
if that's where it came
so
from.
was you so you're in a corporate job, but you're thinking, you know, I'm seeing surfboards and blue skies in my future. Were you? I do believe that there's a lot of people that obviously have these feelings, right? There's a lot of people that are going on the underground, you know, packed in, thinking, you know, this is not for me, but they kind of push that to the side, and just the other side of their brain says, you don't really have a choice, right? You've chosen your life. You're now in this career. Maybe you've got some responsibilities, some commitments, some ties, the mortgage, the kids, all the rest of it. You've got to settle. Now, you was in a position in your corporate job, or maybe you weren't. I don't know. You can tell us. But were you able at that point to turn that corporate position into something that you could take and make remote, or did you have to make a change of career? Did you know that then?
No, so I went into the corporate job and very quickly bought a house and refurbished a house, and then kind of like realised that just didn't just wanted more location freedom than that. So after a couple of years, I was with my husband then, we weren't married. We sold the house and moved back into rented accommodation. And then I did move to France with my corporate job on like an assignment there. And then I moved back to the UK and moved to London. So we'd been up north before. I moved down to London. He had a few moves around. I did resign from the corporate job and I went into contracting to give some more flexibility. You know, it's like you could do a contracting assignment and then stop, or you could choose to take it on. So that, I thought that would give me a bit more flexibility. It did, because I started to work from home. I started to work from home a bit more and just travel to sites for meetings. And that was sort of, you know, that was back in like 2008, I think, 2009, when that was a bit more of an unusual model than it is now. And then, but it didn't really, trying those things, it just wasn't really meeting, I suppose, the need that I had. I think I must have read around about this sort of time, mid-20s, I must have read, you know, good old Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad Poor Dad, and was like, okay, so I'm just trading time for money in lots of different ways. We need to shift this quadrant a little bit. And so that sort of like inspired me really to look at, you know, different things that I could do, and bought a few properties then. So bought a few properties and thought that was great. And then my husband was an engineer, so we decided to do like a global job search and move overseas with his work. And the grand plan was that I would step out of corporate. I bought a couple of houses, you know, whilst in London up north, so there was a bit of distance there, and thought, you know, let's move overseas with his work and I'll carry on and grow the portfolio year by year. how hard can it be? Surely it's the same living overseas as it is living in London. So we did a global job search, and at the time, all the jobs for his field were in Abu Dhabi or in the Middle East, shall we say, and he had a few interviews, and then we moved a couple of months later. And I then, started to buy from overseas, and it wasn't quite exactly as it had been from London. A few things went wrong.
I'm just gonna jump in there, Julie, because there's a couple of things that I want to unpack before we get too far ahead on the timeline. Okay. You said that you bought bought your first property, and you refurbed that property. Now, when you bought that property, was the idea to refurb it and add value and sell it, or was it just because you was living in it, you wanted a nicer property? Or I just want to pin down where the property and the travel kind of started to intersect, and that started to kind of make sense as a potential way forward.
Okay. So the first property we bought to live in, like straight out of university. We both got corporate jobs. We bought a house. It was in pretty good condition, but we refurbished it. And then after a couple of years or 18 months, I think we got it valued, and we were like, it had really gone up. It was probably the right time in the market as well. And we just thought, we can either stay here for another 2 years, at which case we need to refresh it before we sold it, or we could just cash out now. So it wasn't the plan when we went into it, but that was the first one. So that would have been like 2002, 2004 kind of time, when the market was quite interesting. And the first investment one that we bought was in 2009. So it was around about that time, 2008, 7, 8, 9, that I got into like cash flow quadrant. And
so you bought not long after the crash, 2007, 2008. So were things kind of just on the way back up around that time, or you were still at a low point?
No, they were. It was the sort of time where you'd walk into an estate agent, and you would be, one of their first customers all week. They would, quite literally roll out the red carpet and be like, "You're a buyer.
Do you want a coffee? Take a seat. What can we get? You want some biscuits?"
The mortgage world's all changing. Yeah. You always spoke to the director, because everyone else in the staff had been let go, apart from the guy who owned the company. And then especially didn't have a letting side of it, if it was just like the estate agency side. So it was that kind of time. And the mortgage world was all sort of changing daily, weekly as well. Probably was the time when a lot of people were running away from it, but I'd grown up in rental accommodation. So I just was like, people are always going to need homes. If you're going to buy many, if you've got a plan to buy many and regularly, then it was more about starting and getting used to the process rather than waiting for like this right time kind of thing. Which so that would be.
Around this time, had you done any kind of education? You'd obviously read a couple of books, Robert Kiyosaki. Had you done any traditional, signed up for the courses, or was it just all kind of self education?
Yeah, so once, as you say, that was the route, then did some courses and coaching and online research, all of it really. I wasn't really into podcasts then. I don't know if there was podcasts then, I'm not sure, but I wasn't like my go-to listening. So it was more books, courses, like online research, coaching, mentoring, things like that.
So you sold that place, and you saw the potential, right, with the capital appreciation. Okay, maybe you bought at the right time, maybe there was a bit of luck involved, but still, that was like an eye-opening moment where you're like, my God. And I've had that, right, where you can, I've refinanced buy-to-let properties, that I hold in addition to the the Airbnb business, and I've released debt-free equity from those properties. Tax-free money from those properties, and been like, oh my God, like I've just refinanced and accumulated a pot of money that would have cost me, a year, 2 years, I don't know, depending on what you earn, to make that kind of money in a job. So for me, that was a big eye-opening moment. So at this time, was you thinking now, all right, I'm seeing potential. If I can rinse and repeat this, what I've just experienced, or maybe tweak a little bit and add some systems in, this could potentially be the vehicle I'm looking for in order to live this life?
Well, there was quite a big gap between when we bought and sold the house, like our first home, 2002, 2004. Then there was quite a big gap then between then and 2009, which is when I sort of decided that was the business we were going to go into. So I didn't have the knowledge or, anything when we'd bought our first house. That was just
Yeah.
because that was the next logical thing to do, right? You
Yeah.
finish university, you get a job, you buy a house. We just opportunistically sold it. So in around the 2008-9 time, that's when I decided, having looked at a few different businesses, that property was the thing that I wanted to go into, because I was quite passionate about it, having grown up in rental accommodation. Like, I knew there's a lot of people who wanted long-term homes. We'd been evicted a few times as a family when I was younger, and I just thought, like, it never made any sense to me why a landlord would want to evict like a tenant who'd stay there like for 30 years. Like, it just made no sense to me. So when I realised that property was a business, that was like when I started to get educated and want to go into it, which was 2008, 2009. So then I was very much going into it with a buy, rent, refurb, refinance type of approach to it, really.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, really,
repeat.
really
And
cool. I completely get what you're saying there about the tenants. I'm a big believer in, of course, in my own buy-to-lets, I've had my fair share of, people that you wouldn't necessarily want to have in there for a long time. But for the most part, I'd say at least like the 90%, right? The tenants that I've had have been fantastic, and they appreciate the home as much as you want, as much as you do as the homeowner. They want to make it their own home. They pay the rent on time. They look after it. They make it a real family home. And for those people, I would much rather provide a really nice home for them to feel safe and to make, to raise their kids, whatever it is, rather than try and squeeze them, and keep hiking the rent. No, like if they're paying the rent, paying the bills, making a nice home at it, I've got no interest in squeezing anyone like that. I don't know why landlords do that, and then they force them out and make it unlivable. I understand everything's changed now, right? Everything's gone through the roof. Costs for landlords have gone through the roof. So I understand there has to be a little bit of give and take, but definitely looking after your tenants is huge. And like you just said, my family, as in my sister, who's a single parent, and my mother as well, they've experienced that, getting shoved into different properties, houses getting sold, rents being hiked up, or just bad landlords that aren't keeping the property maintained. So I got to a point where I was like, screw this. I don't want to watch my family getting shoved around all these different properties all the time, because it's such a huge upheaval of life, right? Moving properties. So yeah, I was the
yeah.
same. I was like, no, I'm going to buy a place, so I bought a place for them so we could have, that family bolt hole, right, of security, of safety, where that things are going to get dealt with, and you can really make it a home and you can relax, right? Which everybody should have the right to do in their own properties. So,
Yeah.
okay. So we're just talking about buy-to-lets at this point. We're not necessarily I mean, you mentioned about the BRR, buy, refurbish, refinance, rent, if you want to add another R on the end of it. But
Yeah.
I know that you said you had a property, you refurbed it, you sold it. I mean, but you weren't necessarily doing the traditional BRR model then, was you? It was more just.
No, we just
It was just what you
we'd
did.
done the next logical thing. We'd finished university, we got a job, we bought a house. It was just like the next step, and then we just sold that because it was just there was it just seemed like the right thing to do. So there was no education or learning or plan around that. It was just opportunistic. It was sort of 5 years, 4 years, 5 years after that until I really realised that property could be the business that I've
Right.
been looking
Well,
for a while.
I think the BRRR model is really, really cool, and I would imagine that a lot of people do it. It is a great model, but I would imagine, and this is where you're great, right, with what you've done and what you've achieved. You found a way of being able to do it remotely. I would imagine that most people would think, well, in order to do that, we're talking about teams, we're talking about builders, we're talking about problems, we're talking about finance, there's all these moving parts. Surely you got to be there, right? You got to be on site. So at what time did you think that, you'd be able to do this from anywhere in the world? Because that's quite a big thing.
Yeah, so we lived in London and bought the first, couple of houses from London up north. And then so that was 2009. And then we moved overseas in the same year. So, I mean, I had worn out the
Yeah.
M6 a little bit, going backwards and forwards. Like, I was more on the ground. But then I just thought, we'd done quite a bit remotely. So moving overseas, I was just going to scale and repeat the same thing. But I did 2 purchases in the first year or 2 after we moved overseas, and they both went a bit wrong for different reasons. And I got quite embarrassed about it, just felt like I'd just really made a bit of a mess of it. And then I had a huge pause between then and I think it was like 2016. So in those years, between 2010 to 2016, I just like didn't talk about property. I think in those sort of years, I just, I kind of like felt a bit silly, like, that I tried to make it work from overseas and couldn't make it work. It had gone wrong. And, if anyone brought up UK property or wanting to buy a rental in our like expat community or whatever, I'd just dodge the conversation. I'd actively seek to change the conversation. I certainly wouldn't confess that I had a few houses and like I felt like I'd made a bit of a hash of it.
Do you mind touching on that, Julie? What was it that, because I'm all about, there's so many gurus out there, right? Oh, you make millions, financially free in 12 months and all this time, all this talk, which I don't think is necessarily true. We're all about, keeping it real, talking about the good and the bad. So what was it that if it's okay to talk about, what was it that didn't quite work out?
Yeah. And I could go down a hole and explain all this, so I won't. I will keep it headline level. So one of them, the first one, I'd flown to and from the UK for, right? I'd flown back to view it. I'd come back. I'd flown back again. I'd flown back a couple of different times through the refurbishment. And I was just like, this is not sustainable. It's kind of like fun. Like, I'm just flying back to the UK for the weekend to check in on my kitchen and choose my handles. And I was just like, but it's not sustainable. This isn't how you build a portfolio, like flying backwards and forwards all the time. So that one, I was just a bit like, nah, that's not a scalable model that I want to repeat again. So then the next one that I did, I somehow ended up working with a sourcing agent. And I think part of me inside actually wanted to do it myself, but felt like I couldn't because like the last time it hadn't worked. So I thought I had to try something different. And I worked with a sourcing agent, and I was trying to get properties in my like area where I wanted, which was quite specific. I knew where I wanted to buy, but obviously they had like a wider pool of properties, and we kept agreeing deals, which would then fall through, how we do in the whole, fast purchase sort of world. And, I take some accountability for this. I probably felt the pressure that they'd been doing a lot of work and like we'd not got a deal yet, right? And they didn't get paid until completion. And we agreed on a purchase, and it just it was a multi-let, it was a block, there was a few units in it, and they didn't end up all completing. I only ended up actually acquiring one of them. It then took 10 years for me to own the other ones in the block and like complete the purchase of the other ones in the block. So ended up in this not great situation at all, where no one owned all the properties in the block, and it was a pretty small block. So none of us were in a great position because there was, I think, 2 or 3 people who owned them. And it was because I'd worked with a sourcing agent. So I just felt that was a really messy purchase, and it had just sort of gone wrong, really. They were all meant to complete. We were meant to own all of them.
Are you saying that you felt?
Felt quite burned.
Are you saying that you felt pressure
agent again
to move forward with a deal because the sourcing agent had put a lot of work in, or?
Probably, I probably felt a bit of pressure, and there was all sorts of things going on. Probably didn't know all the different things that was going on that were going on in the background as well. So afterwards, I just felt really quite burnt by it, and that was like it
sounds like that. Sounds like that affected you in quite a bad way. Did it make you feel that you weren't capable, that you was a bit of a failure, that this whole thing was going to kind of come crashing down, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I felt quite ashamed that I'd like messed it up. I felt quite stupid, basically, quite naive that I'd ended up in this situation where I just ended up in this, I suppose, risky, but just this not ideal situation. And I just I took accountability for it, and rather than taking accountability and moving forwards and like learning from it and moving on, I hid under a table property wise for 7 years until our life got really chaotic for a different reason. And then that sort of gave me the
It's so
motivation
true,
to
isn't
come
it?
back to it.
And we all do it, right? When you try and do anything even remotely challenging, right? And I'm talking about saying, okay, my job's not enough. This safe little comfortable bubble that I just get up and go into the office with my eyes blindfolded and just do my job and get paid for it. If that's not enough and you're like, no, screw this, I want more, I'm going to try that, or I'm going to try this, or I'm going to give that a go, and I'm going to try and follow my dreams. It is friggin' inevitable, right? That shit's going to go wrong because you are challenging yourself. You are learning new things. You're putting yourself out there. You're challenging yourself. When you put it like that and you say it out loud, it's like, well, yeah, how could I even expect for a minute that everything's going to go perfect? But instead of realizing that and accepting it
Yeah,
and embracing it, something goes wrong and then we beat ourselves up and fall
yeah,
apart instead of going, no, okay, I'm now going to take
and
this, turn it
stop.
on its head,
Yeah,
learn from it, look at what did work, what didn't work, and then implement the things that did in the next step and not the things that didn't. But we don't. We just
yeah,
like, that's it. I'm stupid. I can't do it. Da,
we
da, da,
don't.
da. Yeah, I'm as bad as anyone for that.
And this is and looking back at that time, I think the piece of kind of like the piece that I didn't really have going on then was maybe a really
Right.
strong why, like a really strong like why I was doing it, and I maybe wasn't really into the whole like failing forward and just picking yourself up and going again. Like I let this stuff going wrong stop me, and it was only when like I say, life went chaotic for a different reason a few years ago. I was basically like, for God's sake, we put man on the moon. I've got to be
Did we
able to
put
figure
man on the
out how to
moon?
do
That's for
this.
another
And,
podcast.
that's another podcast. That's not about
Yeah,
nomads.
we could go down that rabbit hole. But absolutely massive what you just said, Julie. And these are the little nuggets that I love that come up in these podcasts, right? Because when you're in the business, I'm not talking about property, I'm talking about business, any kind of entrepreneurial journey. It's this thing that's thrown around that's so obvious to people like us now. There is no point doing any of it unless at the very beginning, the first thing you do is sit down, put up your whiteboard or your notepad or whatever it is, and sit down and spend a frigging week saying, why am I doing this? Right? What is the reason? What is the end result that's going to come of this journey that I'm about to go on? Because that's the stuff that's going to keep you getting up and getting out of bed when shit's going wrong, right? Which it
Yeah,
will, like we just touched on.
yeah.
So you've got to have that so clear in your mind. So you didn't have that. You didn't have this really clear vision of, I want to be traveling. I want to have this nomad lifestyle. I want to, that wasn't clear. That wasn't concrete at that point.
It was. It was. I did. It was definitely something that I wanted. I had the whole plan and everything, but I think what I wasn't probably really quite there was with the whole like mindset. For one, being cheesy, but just because things go wrong, you don't have to let it stop you. I kind of like wasn't really there and all that. So things went wrong, and it stopped me. It wasn't until like 2016, 17 when that was the bit that I started to really address then, like reading different books and just like understanding that if things go wrong, then it's like, okay, so what do we do now? How do we fix this? What are our options? Rather than, oh, it's gone wrong. Oh, in that case, I'm just going to do something totally different and forget about it then. So the why is super important, definitely. But then with that, you've also got to have this like call it what you want, growth mindset, like failing
Yeah.
forward. I'm sure there's a million books on this sort of thing, but just that like just that whole keep going, keep with the
Yeah.
momentum, find solutions. What was it? I love the whole Thomas
Yeah.
Edison
Yeah.
invented how
Hundreds of
many
thousands. Yep.
hundreds or thousands of light bulbs was it before he got the one?
Yeah.
Imagine if he'd have stopped the first time things went wrong. But I wasn't really aware and didn't start to like follow all that stuff up until until the later time. So that was like one of the things that changed for me. And when you accept that things are going to go wrong and you're ready for them, and then become like,
Yeah.
oh, something's gone
Amazing.
wrong, what can I
What
learn
a
from this? This
mindset
is
flip.
exciting. Then you have
What
like
an
more of
absolute
a
incredible
yeah,
mindset flip that is.
yeah,
And it's really, it's a non-negotiable part of going down this road of trying to become the best you, because, unfortunately, the world, I believe, without going down another kind of rabbit hole or way of thinking, but I do think that, governments and society benefits from keeping you small and keeping you, tied into the system, being part of the big cogs that turn to keep this whole mess kind of moving forward, if you can call it that. So what I'm trying to say is that if you try and go off piste, right, with anything, with any kind of business, with any kind of success, it's just the way, unfortunately, I believe the world is to pull you back down, the crabs in the bucket analogy. Is that the right word? It's always going to try and pull you back. So you've got
Yeah.
to flip your mindset, realize shit's going to go wrong, realize you're going to be, have a lot of negative naysayers that are telling you to, come back to the safety zone. It's easier. So you got to be strong. And I think maybe just reflecting back, Julie, as you're talking, that it also sounds like maybe at that point, something that you didn't have was the community, right, of like-minded people. Maybe that when that went wrong, you could have lent on and they would have gone, you know what, Julie, this happened to me. It's all part of the journey. This is what you've got to expect it, lift you up. Like-minded people that are on the same road as you, that's massive as well. Did you have any of that to lean on, or was it just in your own head?
I did. No, so I did have that back then as well, but I just didn't. I think I just got the fear. I just got the fear, and then put property to the bottom of the priority list because felt stupid and embarrassed and all these things. And when I say to the bottom of the priority list, after I took another part-time job that was virtual, that did give me location freedom, that did give me an element of time freedom. So I put that and everything else above property. So there was just never time to get to it. And you asked where did the nomadic thing sort of come from? It came in the middle of those years, really. So, things went wrong, should we say, in 2010, 11-ish, property-wise. I picked it back up again in 2017. But in the middle of that, I think it was around about 2015 or something like that. I remember being on a beach in Sri Lanka with my husband, and the kids were really little. And, I think I must have seen a family who looked like they were traveling with young children. I think with twins as well, actually. And we've got twins. And I remember saying to my husband, I think they're traveling and homeschooling the kids or something. We could do that. And he was like, no, we couldn't. What about school? What about my job? What about your job? What would you do for this? And it was sort of it was a really passing conversation then in 2015. And then in 2017, he kind of said, you know what? I can see that we could do this, that we could make it work. And then we were, I suppose I'd always been working towards it in a way, but then we, really started to have it in our plan.
Amazing.
Talking about
I like that. I like the fact that not you just tick, tick, tick all the boxes, because you're traveling or you're living this way. This is not just a temporary thing. This is your life, right? And I'm not going to say it's perfect. I don't think you would either. There's nothing that's perfect. I'm sure. I know, right? Just because you're waking up in the sun with the sand under your feet doesn't mean you haven't got problems, doesn't mean you haven't got challenges. That's still there. But I would imagine on the whole, you're a hell of a lot happier now than I believe most people are in the rat race, right? In the UK or wherever they are, just kind of living that way because they feel that they have to. And one of the biggest reasons for that, I believe, is the whole kid thing, right? I'm not a parent, so I'm not overly qualified to kind of talk about it, but I do believe that a lot of people are desperate for this life, desperate to leave, desperate to travel, desperate to have experiences, but they tell themselves they can't because they've made this choice. It's one or the other, right? We have kids, we stay, we're stuck, or we don't, we give that up, but then we can have life for ourselves. What's your take on that then?
So I think you've got to follow your heart in some way. So we lived in Abu Dhabi, and our kids grew up in Abu Dhabi, or were growing up in Abu Dhabi. They're still growing up. They're only 10 now. It's why I think being an expat can be great, because if you're living overseas and working overseas, then just in holidays, you can explore a different part of the world, because there's, just because the countries that are really close to you, different places become a weekend destination. So, for example, from the Middle East, you can go to India for a long weekend, or Sri Lanka for a long weekend, right? Where you barely can even get to, right? Just like being an expat is kind of like a hybrid, I suppose. If you're feeling nomadic but don't quite want to jump in because you want the security and things like that, living overseas and working overseas as an expat is sort of like, you know, you in Abu Dhabi, there's sand everywhere. It is the desert. And as a stay-at-home, like I wanted to be an expat, a stay-at-home mum basically, and be present for the kids, but I also wanted to earn an income. So I had a part-time job that I did from home. I mentioned to you, sort of, touched on before, but it still pulled on my time more than I wanted it to, even though it was 18 hours a week. And I don't know, it kind of like hit me through a certain circumstance of events. Like, why was I spending 18 hours a week working for somebody else when I could spend 18 hours a week growing our property portfolio in the UK from Abu Dhabi? And I was quite like realistic about my constraints. And my constraints at the time were like my phone couldn't ring because the kids were really little. You can't be taking phone calls when the kids are little. So I couldn't have my phone ring, and I didn't want to fly back to the UK. So I kind of like just decided that I just had to find a way to make it work because, a few different reasons came into play, but I just got this really, really strong, like, I've got to give this another go. I've got to make it work now because that would give me more time freedom with this like location freedom that we've already got, to live more in the way that I wanted to and be present for the family at the same
amazing.
time.
And again, I kind of tiptoe around the subject because I'm not a parent, so I don't want to kind of preach, and I don't want people who are parents or families to be listening to this going, what the hell do you know? But my own opinion is, I think I know families who have, chose to travel with their kids and raise them in a way that they feel fit, which sits outside of what society expects. And those kids that I've met, right, have the most incredible set of social skills and people skills and things that I'm not saying that kids, in the traditional education system aren't going to learn that. But I just think, someone that comes to mind is some people that I know that chose to raise their kids on a tiny, tiny little atoll in Tonga. They bought like a resort and they raised them from newborns. And, by the time these kids are like walking, they're driving quad bikes, they're pulling out, boat tow hitches, out of the ocean, and they're swimming with whales, and they're, and it's nuts, and they're kite surfing, and they're just so amazing kids. So I think it can absolutely work. I don't, and I also think, while we're on the topic, we'll get off it, but I think that I can go on about it, but the traditional education system now is so archaic, right? Kids are learning things that aren't even relevant in today's world. So I think that's for a whole nother podcast, but I think what you're doing is amazing, really, really inspiring. And I hope that other people who are listening to this can look at you and see the fact that you're doing it with your kids, and it maybe opens the door for them as well, which is really, really amazing. Okay.
And this is where the expat thing, I suppose, is a stepping stone, right? Because whilst we're in Abu Dhabi, the kids went to a British international school. So although we were overseas, they were having like a British education, and it was very well. All the teachers are from the UK, so it was a very a very British experience. It was only when we started traveling, and so they were still getting lots of great experiences, like living in a different part of the world and everything. But it wasn't until it was only 2 years ago when we sort of stepped out and started to do education totally differently and more like world school and homeschool, and then that became another level. But there are similarities between like expat kind of life, especially growing a property portfolio, and nomadic life, growing a property portfolio, because you're still doing it without flying back to the UK.
Absolutely.
Basically.
Okay, so I could just speak about this for days. I've got so many questions, but I suppose we've only got limited time. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of what you do today. So let's, I hope, do our best to try and bust this myth. I don't know all the details of how you run your business or how you've made it work. We'll get into that. But most people's biggest thing that stops them from moving forward with property is the money. Right. So everybody seems to think that you need, hundreds of thousands of pounds in order to get started in property. Now, obviously, once you start getting involved with education, however that looks, whether it's books, podcasts, traditional in-person training courses, webinars, you start to realize that that's actually not the case. And there are ways of doing it in creative ways and, you know, using other people's money and positioning yourself in a way where you can go to investors and stuff like that. But how did it work for you? Were you, you know, were you already in a fortunate position where you could be like a cash buyer and start buying properties that weren't mortgageable and benefit in that way to do the BRR? Or how did that, talk a little bit about that, the financials behind it?
Okay, so it's probably just best if I touched on why
Absolutely.
I just started in 2017 to do this. So in 2016, a family member in the UK got ill, and we got that kind of like phone call that every expat or person who lives overseas dreads, which tends to be in the middle of the night saying someone's ill, you kind of need to come quick. So we kind of did, and you know, months passed, and you're backwards and forwards, you know, just taking the kids out of school and all that sort of thing, for you know, trips back. And then after a few months, the person died, and through this time, I kind of like reduced my work hours because you focus on what's important in that time. And I was only working like 18 hours a week, and it was virtual and it was from home, and it fit in really well with, you know, stay-at-home mum type of life, basically. But then as soon as life went to chaos, and something unexpected happened, a curveball came in, and obviously I stopped working, so I stopped getting my payment every week for the 18 hours, so it drastically reduced. Yet what came in was the money from the houses that I'd bought quite a few years before, some of which I'd made a mistake on and that I felt quite embarrassed about. And I was like, hang on a minute, like life's gone to pot, really? And those things that I've not been talking about, I've been ashamed about, they're still paying me. And this like perfect, you know, work from home virtual job, like the money's just sort of stopped or drastically reduced. So that was the sort of like the trigger, and I was like, right, I've just got to figure out a way of doing more of that, basically. So when life calmed down, it was a case of, you know, looking at the finances, and I you know, I had equity in the houses that I'd bought and wanted to refinance to reuse those monies. But at the time, and I did this quite a few times, I'd walk up to a broker and say, you know, I want to refinance my houses. And they'd be like, okay, what do you do? And I'd be like, well, I'm a stay-at-home mum, I kind of have a part-time job. And they would like, yeah, send your husband in. And I didn't want to do that because we knew that we wanted to travel. So we didn't want to link our, you know, our mortgages to an expat salary, because then we knew we wouldn't be able to set off. So the funding was a challenge, as it is for a lot of people. But I was just really, really keen. Like I had this, like, just really, really wanted to get started. So what I started to do was I started to do portfolio building for other expats. Just, you know, a few on a scale that sort of fit in with life. But I just, you know, there was, when I started to talk about property again, having not spoken about it for quite a few years, there was people who, you know, who were like, oh, you know, when they heard about the type of properties I had and our strategy, they were like, oh, I'd like a portfolio like that. Can you grow it for me? So I took on a, you know, a small number of property sourcing clients, set up a sourcing business. And, you know, they obviously knew that I wasn't in the UK, but because of, like, you know, the systems and processes that I put in place and how I did things and the strategy that I had, they would rather work with me than, say, a sourcing agent who was actually in the UK. So whilst I figured out the financing and the remortgages and things like that, I was building my processes by building my, like, virtual property machine, should we say, for want of a better word, by growing portfolios.
Right. So did you already have those systems in place as that kicked off, or was it kind of, okay, I see the gap, I see the need, I'm gonna make this a thing?
Yeah, it was very much that. Like, you know, I'd last bought in 2011, 10 sort of thing, but I just decided that I was going to find a way to do it for myself, but wasn't able to do my own purchase in the, you know, the short term because of funding, and started to do some portfolio building.
So how does that? Let's talk about the you know, the real logistics of that. What does that look like? I mean, I'm obviously thinking it through in my own head about the steps in the process. How did that start? Did you educate yourself on how to do it, or did you just jump in because you already knew what needed to be done?
Yeah, I there were certain parts of the process that I already knew, and you had to source properties and you had to analyze properties. I knew, what to look for in areas and things like that. What was different was I'm doing it without me actually being on the ground in the UK. So it was about setting up ways of just getting things done without me being in the UK, without me having to fly back and without the phone ringing, but so that you were still, minimizing risk and also not over relying on one person. In my corporate background, I'd been done a lot of work in process design and business process improvement and things like that. So I was very much aware that, if you know what your design principles are, then you can design processes and things to work in a way that you need to. So that was sort of what I
So I'm guessing, or I'm thinking, if I was going to go out and do that, it's basically you got to build a power team, right? So you need the person who's going to view the properties, your agents, you need your solicitors, you need your build teams. So presumably, was there a period of time when you said, okay, I'm going to get into this, I'm going to go down this road? Did you have to then go back to the UK and put in some time to build in those teams and sourcing those teams, or?
So I find a power team a really interesting concept, which I don't fully buy into, because power team suggests that you have one person for each sort of thing who you rely on. But that really doesn't give you the ability to scale. If something happens in that person's life, business, or whatever, you're totally reliant on them, I suppose. If they're not available to do a viewing or do a build project, you've got to wait for them. If they get ill, then so I tend to, and this is some of my corporate background, I suppose, think about more of a power process. You need to get comfortable being able to find who you need to do things and get comfortable with that process, just be aware of having single points of failure. If you have only one person, for example, who can do your viewings for you, then it doesn't really set anyone up to succeed. What happens if they're ill? What happens if they have a situation with their own family? What happens if they go on holiday? And this wonderful deal comes up.
They obviously can't go on holiday. They've got to stay primed, waiting for your phone call.
And then also I find, if you do have single points for things, or single points of success, but also a single point of failure, if that person might start to feel obligated and that things are unequal. So I've always sort of focused on trying to create a power process about how to find who you need and be able to get all the things that you need to get done in different ways, rather than just having one person for this and one person for that. And especially when you're overseas, I know I never want to feel like I've got to jump on a plane to go in and step in and sort something out. Maybe if you're in Europe, that's kind of reasonable and possible for you to do. But the further overseas you are, and especially when you've got family and commitments, and I was doing this, and it was my husband who'd come home on, say, a Tuesday and say, I'm flying to, here, there, or somewhere tomorrow. I just couldn't have this risk or any chance that I'd have to jump on a plane and go back to the UK and sort things out. So I just focused on a power process, getting comfortable with different ways of finding people to do all the different things that need doing, and having multiple ways of getting all the different things that you needed to get done. So I suppose some people would set up their property, but if you're in the UK, you set things up and you do everything yourself, and then you slowly systemize and outsource and all that sort of thing. Whereas if you're overseas, you kind of and you don't want to fly back to the UK. You're forced to do all that sort of stuff first, whilst you're setting things up. So you get the location.
It's a really nice niche, and it's a market that I can definitely see is there, because I think most people agree, with even a basic understanding of property, that the UK, is a pretty solid place to invest, right? Maybe the days have gone of seeing, these ridiculous, triple, quadruple your money in 10-year kind of things. But still, basic supply and demand, too many people, not enough properties, right? As long as you're buying to hold for the long term, you're always going to do well in property. But a lot of people don't want to necessarily live in the UK. So bring those two things together, I can see it being a real gap in the market. But isn't it, Julie, I mean, surely the weak link in this is the build teams, because builders and trades are notorious for needing to be overseen, being unreliable. You know, if you're not just purely in one place, you're not using the same build team every project. How do you get around that without being there?
Well, I mean, how do you handle
Taking
those
lots
problems
of
if you are
donuts.
there, right? You know, I don't know about you, but a lot of my builders are kind of like quite into the health and would be like, "Well, you bring me donuts, but I don't want donuts." You know, I find that I don't know. I find this is something that we can tell ourselves. You know, if I was on the ground, I can make sure that things don't go wrong. But in my build, or maybe things have gone wrong in a build when people have been on the ground, but things go wrong in life, like all the time, whether you're there or not. Like we fall over walking down the street. So it's sort of like if you're growing a property portfolio, if you're doing anything on repeat, sometimes things aren't going to work out. Whether you're there or not there isn't really a factor. It's an easy thing to blame, like, oh, the reason I might be wrong is because I wasn't there. That's what it was. It's because I wasn't there. But it's rarely the reason why something's gone wrong.